I'm sorry to have missed worship with you last week. It was the first time in 7.5 years that I have been too sick to come to worship. But thank you, Pastor Kathy Baines, for filling in for me at the last minute and doing such a wonderful job. I really appreciate you. So I've had plenty of time to think about what I want to say in this sermon. And I think I want to start by saying something controversial. Something that may offend some of you, and if so, I apologize. But it needs to be said. I believe in Pluto. Thank you, Jet. I believe in the existence of Pluto as a planet. And I know recently people have been trying to strip Pluto of its planetness, but I believe in Pluto. I believe in Pluto because very smart people have told me that Pluto exists. It is out there, and it is going in a really big, slow circle. However, I don't believe, my belief in Pluto, I've come to the realization, is fairly unimportant when it comes to my life. Because Pluto doesn't have a plan for me. Pluto has never entered into my life. Why do I care about Pluto? Why do I mention Pluto? Well, it brings us to the next question. What are we really talking about when we say we have faith? What do we really mean when we say we have faith? Do we have faith in a God who exists out there somewhere like Pluto? Somewhere out there, we don't know where God is. We've never seen God, but somebody who's a lot smarter than us told us that God exists, so we just believe that God is out there. Or do we believe that God more than just exists, God is with us, and God has a plan for us? I believe that when we say I have faith, we're saying more than just I believe in God. We're saying I believe in God and I believe in God's plan for me. Midway through my first year of seminary, so I used to work at Chrysler. I quit Chrysler and I went to seminary to become a pastor. Midway through my first year, some of you may have heard this story before, I decided this pastor thing, this seminary thing, was not for me. Instead, I decided that it was time to go back to Chrysler. They wanted me to come back, and I thought it was a good time to go back. And so I flew to Chicago and had an interview, and it went really well. And they said, well, we're currently in a hiring freeze. That'll be over really soon, and then we'll have you come back, and we'll do one more interview, and then we'll bring you back on. And so I got that phone call, and they said, come back to Chicago. And so I got in my car and I left seminary. It was in my rear view mirror, and I was ready to leave it behind. And I was driving across, I believe, I-70 in Ohio, right near Springfield, Ohio, and there was a blizzard. And in the blizzard there was a big giant pileup of cars. And so I couldn't stop, and I hit a semi-truck in front of me and veered off the road, and I got out of my car, and as I was walking away from my car, another car came and hit my car. And my car wasn't drivable, and I was stuck in Springfield, Ohio for the night. And the only people who could come and get me the next day were my friends from seminary. And so they came, picked me up, took me out to breakfast, and said, Nick, God has a plan for you, and God's plan for you is to be a pastor. And I thought that way for a while. But then I thought, well, that's kind of narcissistic to think that God ruined the day and cars of 70 other people just to make sure that I knew that God had a plan. I'm not saying it didn't work that way, but if I were one of the others. So maybe there was a day where you've gotten in an accident and that was God's way of talking to somebody else. I don't know. Certainly a different way to look at it, right? The truth is God does have a plan for each of us. God created us all differently with different gifts, different personalities, different likes and dislikes. And so God has a plan for each of us. And I'm sure that's a sermon, but that's not the one I'm going to give today. I believe we can say that God has a plan for all of us. God has a plan for all of us together. And that's the plan that I want to talk about today. And I think it's a plan that looks a whole lot like the plan that God had for Abram, who then became Abraham. God had a plan for Abraham. And the first thing that God did for Abraham was he gave Abraham a new identity. More than just changing his name, he gave him a new identity. And he said to him, I'm creating an everlasting covenant, in the end of verse 7, to be God to you. To be God to you. From now on, for the rest of your life, and for the rest of the lives of all your descendants, your identity has now changed in that you can identify yourself with me. I am not a God who is far off. I am not a God who is absent. I am here to be your God. I am going to be a God to you for the rest of your life and for the rest of your descendants' lives. He changed his identity. And so now Abraham was identified with God. He gave Abraham a giant family. Abraham was 99 years old. Him and his wife Sarai at that time became Sarah. They had no children. He had no descendants. He had no heirs. They weren't sure what they were going to do. And God said to Abraham, I am going to give you more descendants than you'll be able to count. They will be all over the world. Romans 4:17 says that Abraham became the father of many nations. Every corner of the world, Abraham's family traveled to. And then he said, as Taylor said, that part of what Abraham had to do was to leave, was to had to trust God and go and find a new place to live, because God's plan for Abraham was to give him a new home. To give him a new home. If we go back a couple chapters in Genesis 15, verse 18, the Lord said to Abraham, on that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. God's plan for Abraham was to give him a new identity, a giant family, and a home. And as we think about God's plan for us, God's plan for Christians, God's plan for Lutherans in 2018, the plan is the same thing. God says, I will give you a new identity. Through the waters of baptism and faith in Jesus, who saves us by grace, we become children of God. We identify ourselves with God for the rest of our lives. We belong to God. We belong to a giant family. I love in the verse 25 of our psalm today, from you comes my praise in the great congregation. I just love that. We so often think about the congregation that we belong to as the congregation that sits next to us on Sunday morning. But the great congregation is bigger than just Lutherans. It's bigger than just Abiding Grace. It's all Christianity all around the world, which 31% of the world claims. We are the biggest family in the world. We belong to that family. But bigger than that, we belong to everyone who has already gone home to glory. That is our family. We are part of the great congregation. And when we sing praises to God, we are not just singing it as 150 of us, but we are singing it with the multitudes of angels, the great congregation. And God gives us a home, an eternal home. John chapter 14, verse 3. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you may also be where I am. This life is leading somewhere because of what Jesus did for us in today's gospel. This life is leading to an eternal home. My favorite author, C.S. Lewis, writes that you never know how much you really believe anything until its truth or falsehood becomes a matter of life and death to you. You never know how much you really believe anything until its truth or falsehood becomes a matter of life and death to you. So this is God's plan for you, to give you a new identity, to give you a giant family to be a part of, and to have an eternal home for you. But is that good enough? Is that enough for you? If you were told you only had a few months to live, would that be enough for you? I had that conversation with a friend of mine. Actually, we had it here in front of all of you. And he said a few things that were powerful. And I would like to tell you what he said, but instead, I thought I'd let him tell you.
The doctors say that based on this chemo that I'm taking and the progression of the disease, I probably have till about Christmas, so we'll see. I just decided it was time to stop crying over what I can't do, so I started to focus on what I can do, which is live my life more intensely, more deeply each day. Try to be in a relationship with somebody, in person that is, try to have somebody over to the house or whatever, to come to know them better. And try to become more open, less judgmental, understand more and appreciate people more, if just for their differences and how unique each of them are in the world that we live in. It's tough to do in our regular lives, I think, because we've got so much going on, and we always figure we'll make friends, deeper friends with people later, with that person later. And also, none of us want to get, some of us don't want to get too close to somebody and show ourselves emotionally and drop that guard down for fear that we might reveal some weakness that we may have in ourselves. And so, a lot of times we never make connections with people in life. But when you've got 6 months to live, if you decide that you're going to live it, then you need to drop the pretense, which is what I did. And it's been a wholly rewarding experience, and I've been very blessed, and I've had a lot of peace for it. But I know God is not a punishing God. I've known that all my life. I believe we punish ourselves a lot more than He punishes us on this earth. And I'm not fatalistic either. I think it's what Martin Luther said. I think we're saved by grace, and this is a good thing. Knowing my past, God builds the stage set for us, if you will, and we're just as actors, except that we write our own play, we make our own plans, we chart our own course, we choose the roads that we go down. And of course we know life is what happens. We make all these choices. And this is what's happened to me. So there's nobody to blame. It's just life. We all live, we all die. And God's got His plan for me, and I believe He's doing the best that He wants for me. And my outlook really hasn't changed that much otherwise. Like I said, I'm saved by grace. He's an all-knowing force for salvation. I think I've been a good person overall. He's going to save me, and I'll become part of His eternal kingdom. The doctors say.
I was my friend Curtis, whose funeral was yesterday. He, in August of 2015, thought he had until Christmas, and he changed his life tremendously that summer. He made it a miracle, lived for 2.5 years after that sermon. But when he thought that he had just a couple months to live, and I asked him, how are you going to spend the rest of your time? He talked about being a child of God who was saved by grace. He talked about his identity as God's child. He spent his remaining days in relationship with others. In relationship, if you were given this diagnosis, would you want to go out and meet new people? Or would you just want to sit at home and just spend times with the ones who are closest to you? He spent time getting to know the other members of this giant family that he belongs to. And at the end, he had peace because he knew that he was going to his eternal home. He knew his identity. He knew he was part of a giant family. And he knew that God had prepared a home for him. Our faith in God is not just in God, but in God's plan. Because God's plan is not just our past and our present, but it's also our future. God's plan is bigger, more powerful, and more important than any plan here on earth. You are God's beloved child. You belong to God and to God's family. And God has an eternal home prepared for you. May you be comforted, inspired, and transformed by this great news. Amen.